A few days ago, a report came out on Wisconsin teachers from the Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction, the state DPI. The teachers' unions, the Act 10 haters, tried to play this up as much as possible. The study claimed that nearly 40% of Wisconsin teachers leave the profession before they've taught even 6 years, and I don't doubt that figure. Wisconsin continues to battle a shortage of teachers, and the superintendent, the state superintendent, Jill Underly, immediately blamed underfunded schools and, by extension, Act 10. Her allies on the left and the teachers union piled on, of course. But there are real questions about their findings and their conclusions. So joining me to talk about it now is Will Flanders of the Wisconsin Institute of Law and Liberty, who spent many years doing deep dives into Wisconsin's educational and funding issues and funding questions. Good morning, Will Flanders. How are you?
Good morning. Doing well. Thanks for having me on.
Well, thanks for being on. I just want to start with the basic premise of the DPI report. Wisconsin is seeing 4 of every 10 teachers leave the profession within their first 5 or 6 years of teaching. I assume that's true. If so, is it abnormal, though, in this era?
Yeah, that's the important question to ask, right? The key thing is this different than what we're seeing around the country? And the reality is that teachers leaving the profession early in their career is not a specific problem to Wisconsin. There's been a number of studies over the years that have looked at this question. There was a 2018 study, so pre-COVID. We know things have gotten worse post-COVID, that showed 44% of teachers across the country are leaving their profession in the first 5 years. So a shorter time frame and a higher percentage of teachers than what we're seeing here in Wisconsin. There's been some more recent data from Chalkbeat that looks state by state. They found over 10% of teachers in several states around the country leaving on an annual basis. So if you add that up over 5 or 6 years, we're obviously well over that threshold. So there is a problem with a teacher shortage, but there's no reason to think that specific things that are going on in Wisconsin are the problem. There's some national issues that we can discuss.
Well, I would just point out, again, I think it's a real problem. I think teacher pay is an issue always. We want to value our teachers, but I just want to point out that Jill Underly and the DPI easily could have flipped the narrative of this report the other way and argued, we're actually doing a little better than nationally when it comes to teacher retention. Would that be unfair?
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right.
Okay,
and if you look at all the data that's out there, it's not even spin to say it's that way. Looking at the facts, it is a lower percentage of teachers leaving here than what we see around the country.
Why were these teachers? Were the teachers leaving the profession entirely? Were they tracking them? Were some of these teachers hopping to different districts maybe, but counted as leaving their jobs? Do we know where these teachers were going?
Yeah, it's not fully clear for the Wisconsin data if they're completely leaving the profession. Some might go to another state, some might go to private schools. That is a challenge when you look at this data around the country, is that it's difficult to track teachers from district to district. So it's not completely clear what's going on with the Wisconsin data. So at least they're making the claim that they are leaving the field entirely.
So Superintendent Underly and the left-wing mouthpieces wanted to blame low teacher pay in Wisconsin. Is that a legitimate possibility? Are Wisconsin teachers historically underpaid or compared to national?
Yeah, so this is a common refrain, right? We hear, we heard it in the case of the referendums around the state in the last week as well. But the reality is, even post Act 10, Wisconsin teachers remain in the middle of the pack around the country. We're about 24th or 25th in teacher pay overall. And of course, Wisconsin is a lower cost of living state than a lot of other areas around the country. So you have to take that into account as well. When you look at fringe benefits, so the health care and retirement, post Act 10, there was a decline. We can't deny that there was a decline, but that was just to get the sort of government employees in line with the rest of us and having to make contributions to their retirement and their health care costs. And that's something that I think is rational across the board, and a lot of other states do too. So when you look at declines, it's not in salary; it's a little bit in fringe, but I think that's entirely justified.
Well, and we're talking to Will Flanders, a researcher for Wisconsin Institute of Law and Liberty. Act 10 mostly affected the fringe benefits of these teachers, as you point out, and how big a portion of their health insurance costs they needed to pay on their own. Most districts went from free to some contribution, but come on, that can't be a game breaker for teachers who enjoy their profession. I mean, that's how they want to couch this.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that most people, when you're looking at a new job, yeah, you may look at the benefits, of course, but I think the thing most folks are focused on is the salary, and there's no evidence that the salaries have declined. And again, I think it's completely rational that we ask teachers and other government employees to contribute some amount to those benefits. And if it's a competition between states, we're thinking of many other states ask their public employees to do so as well.
Yeah, and we're more than a decade past Act 10 now. We've seen the governors and legislatures since pour money into education and into school funding. I can only assume the teacher salaries have also increased during that time as well. We do not have teachers working at 2011 levels of pay, do we? or do we?
Yeah, so I think when you look over time, the pay is sort of kept up with inflation to a large extent. Maybe there's a slight decline, but of course, if you look at your own pocketbook, right, with Joe Biden in office the last few years, we all know that nobody's salary has kept up with inflation the last couple of years. But what's interesting is that Underly makes the claim that we need to be funding our schools, but when you look at the data, we're actually spending more than we were in the year 2004 now, in the year 2000 as well. We're spending more than we were back then. What they like to point to is the year 2010. I think we discussed this maybe a few weeks ago, that that was a high watermark for spending in the state. That was right before the effects of the Great Recession were felt. But even when you look at 2010, with adjusted for inflation, we're actually spending even more than in that year now. So there's really no way to make the claim that the schools are underfunded. We're spending more than $16,700 per student, and that's more than an inflation-adjusted $16,500 or so that we were spending in 2010. So there's really no justification in that regard.
We're talking with Will Flanders. So if we want to engage in a more honest effort to keep young teachers in the profession, how should we go about it? I know that's a huge question to ask you at the spur of the moment here, but you've been looking into some of this stuff. How do we try to improve teacher retention, do you think?
Yeah, that's the key question, right? And it is something that we wrestle with both in Wisconsin and nationally. We just had a school board summit last Friday. We heard from some teachers, and one of the things that they told us, and something we're familiar with, is that the biggest issue teachers face in the classroom today is with school discipline, particularly in the aftermath of COVID, but even going back before that. Many teachers feel unsupported in the classroom. They have a student who's misbehaving, and they're back in the class 5 minutes later with a lollipop and pat on the back, rather than maybe getting suspended or at least having some sort of a discipline issue applied. Teachers feel unsupported. That leads to disruptive classrooms, and that leads to teachers that are burnt out and can't conceive of remaining in an environment like this long term. So while there are other issues, and we can talk about apprenticeships to get more teachers more classroom experience prior to getting in the classroom. I think that, or getting in the classroom full time. I think that discipline is something we really need to focus on, and getting away from the politically correct discipline practices that have dominated the last few years.
I would agree with that wholeheartedly. Having taught myself and having a number of teacher friends that continue to this day, I talk to when they talk about what's going on in the classroom and going on in their schools. I couldn't agree more. Discipline needs to be focused on more support from administration and more support from parents. Sadly, we've sort of gotten away from that era in which the parents' instinct was to back up the teacher rather than back up whatever nonsense was coming out of their kid's mouth. When this report came out last week, a liberal on X sent it to me and said, "You're ignoring an important story." And my response to him was, "I saw it and I don't buy it." Teachers, I think, are struggling with more difficult kids, crummier parents who won't back them up, more days that they're out of the classroom as teachers doing crummy, woke, mandatory seminars. They're getting little or no appreciation. I think there are many reasons fewer want to do this job long term anymore, and pay would just be one of them. So
you're absolutely right. Yeah, we can't ignore pay, but there's so many other things, as you say.
Yeah. So would you consider that you'd consider that a fair take on why 4 in 10 teachers last less than 6 years? I would also want to know how many are moving maybe to the private schools where they feel like they are getting a little bit more support and they aren't dealing with kids that are quite as difficult.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. It's a little more challenging to get the data because they're moving into the private sector, but certainly anecdotally, I've heard evidence that teachers move from a public school where they're probably paid more to a private school where they're likely paid less. But because the environment is better, as you say, that's a big driver of sort of making the move. One other thing you mentioned is dealing with parents. I think we shouldn't ignore that reality that parents have made things more challenging with higher chronic absenteeism and things like that in recent years. That students are out of class more. A lot of times parents don't seem to care as much. So obviously a key and integral role when we think about the work that teachers have to do.
And once again, I just have to applaud Will, the Wisconsin Institute of Law and Liberty, that does all sorts of legal work on behalf of better government, smaller government, looking out for taxpayers and looking out for our freedoms. But then we also have the research wing that you're a part of. That you're the research director over there, right?
That is correct. Yep.
Yeah. So so you're running this part of the Wisconsin Institute of Law and Liberty. That if we wouldn't have really anyone pushing back on a report like this that comes out and just blames Act 10 and doesn't take the more honest, more complicated picture here. So thanks for what you do as well, and thanks for being on this morning.
Thanks so much. Have a great day.